and welcome to this evening's event. My name's Christina Bradstreet. I'm head of programs at the Association for Art History. And just to start by telling you a bit about the Art History Residency. It was launched in 2020 and is provided in partnership with the Ampersand Foundation. It offers researchers the opportunity for concentrated time to develop their work at Wigwell Lodge in Derbyshire. So this is a chance for the recipient to further their work in a quiet setting, in a well-appointed, to use estate agent speak, a well-appointed two-bedroom house with all household costs covered, maintenance and cleaning provided, and with a £1,000 per month stipend. So if that sounds tempting, do think about applying. The deadline recently passed for the 2025 residency. But if this sounds appealing for October 2026 to January 2027, do look out for the call for applications, which will be next autumn. It is a competitive process, and you do need to be eligible to work in the UK. And we also ask that the recipient give a talk on their work to our audiences. And so that's exactly what this evening's speaker is doing. Susannah Thompson was our 2023 art history resident. Susannah is a writer, critic and art historian from Newcastle upon Tyne. He's recently joined Manchester Metropolitan University as Professor of Fine Art at Manchester School of Art. Her research interests focus on interdisciplinary and feminist approaches to art criticism and broader forms of art writing and contemporary art in the UK. Her recent projects have included work on the Scots-Ghanaian artist and writer Maud Salter, women's painting practices in post-war Scotland, and the development of creative and expanded forms of art criticism since the 1960s. And during her residency, Susannah's research focused on the relationship between neoclassical sculptor Edmonia Lewis and Edmonia's patron, John Crichton Stewart, the third Marquess of Bute. Her talk this evening is Jesus in the Lumber Room, Edmonia Lewis's Bust of Christ. So the talk will be about 45 minutes, followed by a time for questions. Please do write these in the chat as we go along. And I'll hand over now to Susannah. Welcome.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for coming along this evening. And thank you again to the Association for Art History and the Ampersand Foundation for arranging the event. This time last year, I was ensconced in Wigwell Lodge in Derbyshire as the art history resident, with only my books for company. And I have to say, it was absolutely blissful. So yes, please do apply for the residency if that sounds appealing. I want to begin today's lecture with a few brief reflections. And these might sound anecdotal, but I'm sharing them to provide some context around how I arrived at this evening's topic. As Christina mentioned, my writing and research usually focus on modern and contemporary art. So a talk on a mid-19th century neoclassical sculpture is probably a bit of a surprising choice. But as I'll go on to show, there are a series of interconnecting threads between my usual areas of research and the work of Mary Edmonia Lewis. So I'm going to begin with a potted history of Lewis's life and career for those of you who might not know her work, and then I'll double back for a few moments to consider why and how I first encountered her work. But I'm going to share my PowerPoint for the next part of the discussion. Okay, so to introduce Mary Edmonia Lewis. Edmonia Lewis was the first woman of colour, in fact, the first person of colour, to achieve international recognition for her work as a sculptor. She was born in Greenbush, New York, to an African-American and First Nation Chippewa mother and an African-American father, though both parents died when Lewis was a child. Her older brother Samuel was a self-made businessman who paid for her education at an abolitionist school in McGrawville, New York, and from 1859 at Oberlin College in Ohio, which had admitted African-American students since 1835. But in spite of its apparently progressive ethos, Lewis suffered numerous incidents of racial discrimination at Oberlin, including accusations of poisoning and theft and serious physical assault, and she left in 1863 without graduating. On the advice of the abolitionist orator and writer Frederick Douglass to go east or abroad, she moved to Boston, and it was there that she embarked upon her career as an artist before leaving for Italy in 1865. So other than very, very kind of minor forays into drawing at Oberlin College, she had no formal training in sculpture and received only basic and formal guidance from established sculptors such as Anne Whitney and Edward Brackett. Lewis initially made her name as an artist through the production of medallions like this one and portrait busts of abolitionists and Civil War heroes such as Robert Gould Shaw, John Brown and Wendell Phillips. She was treated as something of a novelty by the white liberal abolitionist community, and her work was championed by abolitionist writers and activists as an example of what Black people could accomplish in the arts. The fact that the themes of her work also promoted the abolitionist cause added obviously to her popularity in Boston. And it was actually the success of Lewis's portrait of Shaw, leader of the 1st Black Regiment in the Civil War, along with money saved from a teaching job in Richmond, Virginia, that enabled this move to Italy in 1865. She travelled back to the USA frequently for exhibitions and sales, but she would be based in Rome for almost the rest of her professional career before moving at the end of her life to Paris and finally to London in 1901, where she died in 1907. Before I return to a closer examination of Lewis and the sculpture we're here to discuss tonight, I want to start this talk with a rather more subjective account of my own introduction to her work. And in doing so, I want to try and reflect on some of the broader concerns or tendencies within the discipline of art history itself. The generative nature of much art historical research, for example, or the role that contemporary artists have played and continue to play in revising and critiquing the art historical canon. I'd like also to consider the serendipity and sometimes the cyclical nature of the development of a research project, and in this case, the unexpected importance of social media in fostering transnational communities of art historians, artists, and researchers. So I'm going to very briefly take you back to my student days in the mid-1990s. So I studied art history at the University of Glasgow between 94 and 98. For my undergraduate degree, it was a completely new subject for me. I had no experience of the history of art as a discipline, hadn't studied at A-level or higher, had limited knowledge or awareness of contemporary art at that point. So what was I thinking? By second or third year, I began to explore different methodologies and theoretical approaches to the history of art in the wake of the so-called new art history. And in common with many of my peers, my art historical role models at that time and still were figures like T.J. Clarke, Griselda Pollock, Lucy Lippard, Linda Nochlin, and others, Marxist and feminist art historians, social and critical historians of art. And at that time, amongst the textbooks and surveys popular with undergraduate students and many more people were books like Whitney Chadwick's Women, Art and Society. And it was through this book, first published in 1990, that I became aware of the work of sculptor Edmonia Lewis. I hadn't heard of her before, and at that time she was arguably yet to be recovered, having been largely forgotten by art history for most of the 20th century, with a few notable and honourable exceptions. She was certainly not represented in major public collections in the USA in the way she is now, and her name was never mentioned during my 4 years as an undergraduate student in Scotland. But to return to my own story briefly, jumping forward about 5 years to the early 2000s, by 2002, there is a point to this, I was working as an exhibitions assistant at Glasgow School of Art while studying for a master's degree. And one of the exhibitions I worked on was a two-person show of the work of Labaina Himid and Maud Salter called Speak English. As a student, I'd invigilated exhibitions in Glasgow, which included Salter's work, but this was really my first meaningful encounter with her work, and it had a really lasting impression. My interest in both artists continued and continues, but I was particularly interested in Salter's work as a working-class Glaswegian feminist whose career encompassed creative and critical writing, publishing, editing, curating, activism, and contemporary art. For me, one of the most compelling projects was an exhibition I'd only experienced secondhand through documentation. And again, to reflect on art history, this is why exhibition catalogues and documentation of exhibitions are so important. Held at Tate Liverpool in 1990 to 91, the exhibition called Hysteria was a solo show of Salter's work, and it centred on a fictional retelling or revisioning of the life and career of Edmonia Lewis. Fast forward again, if you will, from the beginning of my interest in Maud Salter's work in the early 2000s to a chance encounter on social media, which seemed to bring these apparently diverse interests together. So in 2015, a Facebook post from Mount Stewart, a neo-Gothic Victorian mansion on the Isle of Bute, the west coast of Scotland, announced that amongst the thousands of works held in the collection, one small sculpture in the collection was a bust of Christ by the sculptor Edmonia Lewis. So I'd been researching Maud Salter's work about Edmonia Lewis from a home in Glasgow, not knowing that only 2 hours away at Mount Stewart was one of the only 2 works by Edmonia Lewis herself in a UK collection, and the only one in Scotland. This is obviously an image of Mount Stewart itself. At the time of, I'll click back to the bust of Christ image. At the time of Salter's 1990 exhibition Hysteria, this sculpture had been in storage for over 80 years. Until 1995, the property had still been a private family home, and throughout the late 20th century, Lewis's work in turn had seemed to have been forgotten. There were inquiries by researchers lured by primary sources linking Bute and Lewis, but they didn't lead very far. And more broadly, Lewis herself had fallen from view and dropped out of a lot of art historical accounts. So when Maud Salter and other artists were making work about Lewis in the 80s and 90s, even her place and date of death remained unknown. Much of Salter's interest in Lewis, in fact, focused on this apparent disappearance, her invisibility as in both a literal and figurative sense. It wasn't until around a decade ago, that American researchers, primarily Marilyn Richardson, Bobby Reno, and Albert Henderson, finally solved the mystery of Lewis's final years by tracing her death certificate through records in London. And it seemed, in spite of worldwide fame in her lifetime, Lewis had faded into obscurity as the 20th century progressed. The only exceptions, but they're important ones, were sporadic mentions or inclusion in art historical survey books, and sometimes in thematic exhibitions of African-American art or of women's art. But for the most part, where it did resurface, Lewis's reputation and legacy was most visible through contemporary art, through the work of artists who were attempting to identify affinities, lineages, and precedents for their own creative practice, and who called out erasures and omissions as they found them. In the UK, for example, long before the US revival of interest from around the mid-2000s, it was artists like Maud Salter who sought to remind audiences of this once famous sculptor. And 7 years before Salter's exhibition Hysteria in 1990, the artist Marlene Smith paid tribute to Lewis in her now iconic work, Art History. You can see an image of Edmonia Lewis in the top of the row of images. And this work is currently on show in the major survey show Women in Revolt, which is at the National Galleries of Scotland, and soon to tour to the Whitworth in Manchester. Lewis has also been the focus of artist-led research projects by artists such as Sonia Boyce, so the Black Artists and Modernism Project, and also Lubena Himid's exhibition, Meticulous Observations and Naming the Money at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, which is also the home of the only other Lewis work in the UK in a public collection, at least, as far as we know. So this really, the reason for this preamble is to show how important it is to acknowledge and remember the points at which art and art history intersect, the role contemporary artists can play in art historical research, artists' contribution to the maintenance of art historical legacies, and the useful correctives they can offer to academic research. It's also worth noting, I think, that in a UK context, it's been almost exclusively Black British feminist artists who played this crucial role in researching and recovering Lewis. And in this sense, I'm reminded of a quote that I often return to. If you've heard me speak before, I've probably quoted it, and it's by the late American artist Mike Kelly. And it's in an introduction to a collection of essays by the artist John Miller, and Kelly wrote that he was, and I quote, horrified by the oppressive, institutionalized version of art history dominant now. He wrote, when I look at current academic revisionist art histories addressing periods familiar to me, I'm dismayed by the choice of figures deemed worthy to represent them. Most of the artists that influence me are absent from these accounts. Historical writing becomes a duty for the artists at this point. In other words, to reiterate my point, artists have often played a crucial role in correcting art historical accounts produced by academics like me, producing counter-narratives and alternative histories that are, for them, much more authentic and representative of the art world within which they operate beyond the academy. So my purpose in including this kind of anecdotal account of how I became interested in the work of Lewis is to really kind of make this point again. And sorry, this is an image of the other work in the Walker Art Gallery by Edmonia Lewis. It's really to show that it's been artists, Maud Salter, Marlene Smith, Labena Himid, and others who've played an instrumental role in reviving her reputation. And I wanted to acknowledge the ways in which Lewis's intergenerational influence and legacy continue to be manifested within contemporary art. So Gisela Torres, for example, has made a wonderful kind of body of work about Lewis. So to get back to the main focus, Lewis's bust of Christ. How does the story of Edmonia Lewis connect Scotland, the third Marquess of Bute, and Mount Stewart? Why was Lewis's bust of Christ deemed an exciting discovery in 2015 and again in 2021? Did it disappear from view? And if so, what led to its so-called rediscovery? So for the rest of tonight's talk, I want to try and cover these 3 points. The first is to look at the circumstances that may have led to the work's acquisition. So I'll be looking at provenance and presenting a short object biography. I'd then like to look at the formal qualities of the work and reflect briefly on the specific conditions and context of its production. And finally, I'd like to consider the significance of Bust of Christ within Lewis's broader body of work and reflect on its place in contemporary culture. It's a speculative reflection. So firstly then, how did a sculpture made in Rome in 1870 by an African-American and Chippewa woman end up in a mansion on an island off the west coast of Scotland, hidden from view until 2021? So I'm going to provide a bit of context hopefully here. Lewis's relocation from America to Italy in 1865 followed a by then established pattern. From the 1820s onwards, Italy had become home to a steady flow of American neoclassical sculptors, including figures such as Hiram Powers and William Wetmore Story. Aside from ready access to some of the most famous works of art in the Western canon, Italy provided commercial opportunities for artists in the 19th century. Travel guides began to list artist studios as tourist destinations on the Grand Tour, leading to purchases and commissions by wealthy patrons. American artists initially established themselves in Florence and from the 1850s in Rome. Italy provided sculptors with an abundant supply of marble from Italian quarries, along with the skill and craftsmanship of affordable artisans to help them carve it. For Lewis, there was a further crucial reason that a move to Rome was an attractive proposition. Having followed Frederick Douglass's advice to move east to Boston, she now returned to his guidance to move abroad and left Boston in the year that the abolition of slavery was finally achieved in her homeland. A New York Times interview entitled "Seeking Equality Abroad," which you can see here, Lewis claimed, "I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my colour. The land of liberty had no room for a coloured sculptor." Lewis was initially based in a studio that had belonged to Antonio Canova, and a social and professional circle included a group of expatriate American women sculptors based in Rome, such as Harriet Hosmer, Anne Whitney, and Emma Stebbins. Her early works, as I've mentioned, were medallions and portrait busts, and she continued to produce portrait busts throughout her career. In Rome, her works became bigger in scale, more complex and more ambitious. Both then and now, her work was often understood as being autobiographical in some way. Her figurative sculptures based on Longfellow's famous poem Hiawatha, for example, were and are often read as being reflective of her own biracial heritage, while works like Forever Free continued the abolitionist themes for which she had made a name. Perhaps unsurprisingly, much was made of the fact that she was a Black artist representing abolitionist or so-called Indian themes, something Lewis sometimes used to her advantage commercially, in spite of her private reservations about being regarded as exceptional because of her colour, because of her racial identity. Like many of her peers and contemporaries, she made works based on classical, biblical, and mythological themes as well, such as her most famous work, The Death of Cleopatra. She sold her work directly from the studio by commission and subscription and through exhibitions and fairs. And unlike most of her peers, her American expat associate artists, she wasn't independently wealthy and relied on sales to continue her professional life as an artist. As Edmonia Lewis began to establish herself in Rome in the mid-1860s, John Crichton Stuart, the third Marquis of Bute, was about to turn 21. In September 1868, he assumed full control of the family estates, from which he received an annual income of around £300,000. This made him the richest man in Britain at the time and one of the wealthiest people in the world. Crichton Stuart was a descendant of the royal house of Stuart and the great-grandson of John Stuart, the third Earl of Bute, Prime Minister to King George III. The third Marquis, or Bute as I'll refer to him from now on, was an archetypal Victorian polymath, an industrialist, writer, historian, traveller, theologian, and philanthropist. He became one of the most significant patrons of the arts of the Victorian period and was considered to be eccentric both personally and politically. But for our purposes today, he scandalised British society by converting to Catholicism in December 1868. The news of his conversion was widely reported, and it was frequently described as a perversion or a defection in the largely Protestant English and Scottish press. But it was his conversion to Catholicism that took Bute to Rome in February 1869 to be confirmed by Pope Pius IV. Bute returned to Rome in November of that year for the opening of the First Vatican Council, and he stayed in Rome until summer 1870. It seems likely then that Lewis's bust of Christ was purchased or commissioned during this period. Excuse me while I have a sip of water. The problem for art historians, to my knowledge at least, is that there are no records linking that specific work to Bute at the time of its production and supposed acquisition. What we do know is that Bute commissioned work from Lewis between 1869 and 1870, and that one of those works was a religious sculpture, though not bust of Christ. In April 1870, the newspaper The Brooklyn Eagle reported, I quote, "Miss Edmonia Lewis has received orders from works, plural, from the Marquis of Bute." Another contemporary source, Laura Bullard, writing in New York's Revolution magazine in 1871, noted, I quote, "A fine group of the Madonna with the infant child in her arms and two adoring angels at her feet has been purchased by the young Marquis of Bute for an altarpiece. Unlike the bust, it's thought that this Madonna altarpiece was lost in a fire at Mount Stuart in 1877, and unfortunately there's no trace of it today, or none that I'm aware of. So hopefully someone can correct me and tell me they found it. But whatever Bute bought, as a result of his patronage, Lewis was able to pay off the mounting debt she owed due to her unorthodox practice of making works without a prior commission, and in some cases, shipping unsolicited works to would-be buyers. Her debts, largely for buying marble and shipping costs between Italy and America, would have been very significant. News of these financial troubles was reported in the Boston newspaper The Commonwealth in 1869, and also in the Catholic newspaper The Tablet in 1870. In these reports, Bute's presented as a kind of white saviour, a pattern of critical framing that persisted for Lewis in spite of the fact that a number of her wealthy patrons in the US were African American. But Bute's purchases undoubtedly did help Lewis's financial situation, but it seems unlikely that the works he bought were pity purchases made only to rescue an artist from financial straits. We know, for instance, that he returned to Lewis and brought further works in the 1880s, so quite a long time after the date of bust of Christ. And we know that he was extremely particular and discerning in the works of art and design that he commissioned. However, in 1870, the report in the tablet read, Lord Bute is known in England principally from the fact of his having joined the Roman Catholic Church. I must now introduce him as a patron of art, and under circumstances which do great credit to his kindly feelings. 4 or 5 years have passed since a brief notice was published in the Athenaeum of Miss Lewis, a lady of colour, who had settled in Rome as a sculptress. She has struggled against many difficulties, and this season has been a bad one for art, and the poor lady has suffered from want of patronage. Her history was mentioned to Lord Bute by some benevolent friends, and he paid her a visit, which resulted in the purchase of a statue of the Madonna and the Bambino for £300. This is not necessarily a completely reliable source. The cost is also quoted in other contemporary accounts as £3,000. So there are inconsistent reports. But if Bute did visit Lewis, this is the only account we have of a first-hand meeting. And you may have read about her studio in a travel guide. So Lewis's studio address was listed in a number of guides to Rome from 1867 onwards. Equally, he may have read about her work in British newspapers. He's known to have been a reader of the Scotsman newspaper, for example, which had carried news of the Negro sculptress as early as 1866. And it's also possible that Bute's society friends were aware of her work through the affluent American expatriate community with whom she was associated, hence the mention of her benevolent friends in the tablet report. Whatever the case, it's clear that Bute had countless alternatives in Rome, of all places, when it came to buying or commissioning Catholic works of art. So his choice of Lewis does seem particularly specific. I'm not trying to imply that Lewis's race or gender were the reason he became her patron and bought her works, but her profile as an artist may certainly have played a part in piquing his interest, along with her growing fame. There's evidence to suggest, for example, that for all his political and religious conservatism, and for all the expectations a man of his class and position may have had in the Victorian era, Bute was unusually progressive and practically supportive in his views and actions both towards women and towards people of colour. He was described as a conservative in name, but liberal in practice. He was an active campaigner for women's education. He took an active role in his children's lives, including being present at their birth, which is very unusual for the time, and had a close circle of friends who were older women, most of whom were social reformers, feminists, proto-feminists, and in same-sex relationships. He wasn't interested in hunting or fishing. He hated animal cruelty, and he was a philanthropist for a really wide number of causes. He donated money to fund the building of a synagogue in Wales, and as rector of St Andrews University, he campaigned to increase the recruitment and inclusion of Jewish students. For his time and position then, in spite of his extreme financial privilege, Bute was something of a maverick. Ultimately, though, Bute's link with Lewis was one of shared religious identity. Both were described many times as devout Catholics. None of the works Bute bought from Lewis were of the abolitionist, literary, or Indian-themed works that made her name. His interest was exclusively in the religious works that became an increasing focus for Lewis in the latter part of her career, partly due to the continued support of Catholic patrons, the broader decline in neoclassicism as a style, and the broader decline of interest in abolitionist subject matter as her career progressed, or as time progressed. So we have a clear sense of why Bute would have been interested in a sculpture of Jesus Christ, but how it came to be Mount Stuart remains something of a mystery. And this is where I've attempted to do a little object biography. So Bute purchased at least 3 different works from Lewis between 1870 and the late 1880s, as I've indicated, but Bust of Christ is the only remaining work in the collection today. And frustratingly, it's the only work from which no primary source can be found regarding its purchase or commission. But bust of Christ was not mentioned in any scholarship on Lewis that I can find prior to its so-called rediscovery in 2015, except for a tiny footnote in a 2011-2012 biography of Lewis by Harry and Albert Henderson, which tells us that a Dublin newspaper reported the sale of a bust of Christ by Edmonia Lewis as part of the estate of Monsignor Capel of Kensington. So in my view, there are two possible answers. This is Capel. The question of the work's entry into the Bute collection. The figure of Monsignor Capel, another remarkable and intriguing character, offers us a compelling connection, I think. Capel was the Irish priest credited with Bute's conversion to Catholicism. They'd met when Bute was studying at Oxford, at a point where he'd begun in earnest to consider converting. December 1868, and he was part of Bute's entourage in Rome in 1869-70. So in the absence of other records, it would seem that bust of Christ was either bought by Bute for Capel in Rome in 1870 and bought back from him in 1880 when Capel was declared bankrupt, of which there is a very interesting backstory, or that the original purchase was Capel's, which would explain the lack of mention of it in any of the Bute records. Whatever the case, it's the only clear link joining Bute, Mount Stewart, and bust of Christ today. A far more simple explanation, of course, is that Lewis made more than one copy of the bust, as was very common with a number of our other portrait busts. But the only known or extant version is the one at Mount Stewart, and it's impossible so far to establish whether or not the bust once owned by Capel is the very same one now held at Mount Stewart. Thanks to Mount Stewart's former archivist Andrew MacLean, including the current curator Jessica Inslee and archivist Lindsay Nairn, and the dogged inquiries of researchers over the years, two small pieces of evidence were found in the archives around 2002, which offer a couple of further clues in the object biography of bust of Christ. One is a photograph that shows the work on display on a table at Mount Stewart in 1905, and the other from 1910, I don't have an image of, sorry, is an inventory which lists the work as being stored in the lumber room, hence the title of my talk, Jesus in the Lumber Room. What we know for certain then is that even if the work was not taken straight to Bute, the Isle of Bute, in 1870, by 1905 it was on display in the house. And we also know that just 5 years later, by 1910, it's been consigned to storage, as the inventory tells us, where it would remain until 2021. So why is this a rediscovery? And should it be called a rediscovery? The links between Lewis and Bute were widely reported in their lifetime. He was known to have been a patron, and in this sense, the fact that a work exists in the collection today shouldn't be seen as a surprising discovery. But it was a rediscovery for audiences and researchers of Lewis's work in the sense that until 1995, as I mentioned, Mount Stewart had been a private collection. In addition, the sheer scale and volume of the Bute collection and archives meant that identification and attribution proved to be a really difficult task. As I've noted, beyond the work itself, only one photograph and one entry in an inventory connect the story of artist and patron, and these only surfaced, to our knowledge, in the early 2000s. These logistical and circumstantial complexities, along with the fact that a fire in 1877 was thought to have destroyed a significant part of the collection, stacked the odds against rediscovery, as did the fact, let's face it, that bust of Christ isn't particularly distinctive looking within a collection of thousands of works. Even for researchers familiar with Lewis's work, this is a relatively minor work, and one which isn't characteristic of the works for which he's most famous. As such, it was only due to Mount Stewart's social media post of 2015 that contemporary audiences and researchers became aware of its existence, and that long-standing researchers who had been asking questions for some decades had their inquiries confirmed. I've looked briefly at Lewis and Bute's lives, and I've considered how it may have entered the collection at Mount Stewart. What I haven't done yet is actually describe the work itself. Perhaps it's too obvious to state that it's part of the art historian's role to engage in some degree of formal analysis or visual description. But in Kabina Mercer's famous 1919 essay, Black Art and the Burden of Representation, he decried the insistence of reading Black art only in terms of representation and content rather than form. In relation to Lewis's work in particular, Kirsten Pye Buick has written an incisive critique of the tendency to read Lewis's work as a reductive and simple expression of authorial identity. In this book, Child of the Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis and the Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject, Pye Buick claimed that even where Lewis's work can be read to some degree as reflective of her identifications, she consistently strove to maintain distance between her personal identity and subject matter. That if and where her works were self-referential, they were refracted through literature, mythology, and so on. In other words, because Lewis's life is so remarkable and so interesting, it can be easy to lose sight of the works themselves. If we rely too heavily on biography to the exclusion of a critical or contextual understanding of form and style, we do a disservice to the works she produced and to the discipline of art history. But what's interesting about Bust of Christ is that it complicates some of these very tendencies through its form. So let's attempt to look briefly at Bust of Christ in more detail, even though neoclassical sculpture is not my field. So you'll have to bear with me if it's a little bit straightforward, but I'll do my best. Bust of Christ is a small portrait bust in white marble. It's around 24 inches high and it's mounted on a small cylindrical socle. Its form aligns with conventional Western art historical images of Christ as a white European man with a long, narrow face, classical Greek nose, high brows and cheekbones, and evenly proportioned symmetrical features. The face, slightly uplifted, turns subtly to the side and wears a serene expression. The hair, wavy and parted in the center, flows to the shoulders, resting on a simple collarless tunic, perhaps referencing the so-called seamless robe of Christ. The beard is short and slightly forked, echoing representations of Christ throughout art history, such as the medieval and hugely influential Volto Santo in Lucca Cathedral, or Giovanni Caccini's late 16th century architectural sculpture of Christ the Redeemer in Florence. The upper torso forms the sculptural support, while the socle, also in white marble, is identical to those used in earlier portrait busts by Lewis. Directly beneath the hairline at the base of the sculpture, an inscription reads, Edmonia Lewis, Roma, 1870. Although invisible as one looks at the work from the front, it's the only formal element of the work that links directly artist and subject. In Lewis's portrayal, Christ's hair, beard, and dress echo early Renaissance art, such as Dürer's famous Christ-like portrait of 1500. Centuries later, but only a few years before Bust of Christ, pre-Raphaelite paintings such as Holman Hunt's The Light of the World of 1851 or Ford Madox Brown's Jesus Washing Peter's Feet continue this apparently unchanged representation of Christ in Western art. Lewis's work draws on archetypal images of Christ then, but it's also thoroughly contemporary in its adherence to the tenets of neoclassical figuration. In terms of material, as Charmaine A. Nelson has argued, neoclassical sculptors privileged white marble as an ideal medium. They rejected the polychromy of actual antiquity and helped cement the concept of white as a signifier for purity, beauty, and goodness. Neoclassical artists saw their work as the creation and transmission of a moral message or art for art's sake, with aesthetic choices made in the service of this message. So what's interesting is that in this sculpture, Lewis chose not to represent a specific episode in the life of Christ. There's no active expression, which might allude to Christ's agony in the garden, for example. There's no crown of thorns or symbols of resurrection. Rather, he's seen in repose, meditative, restrained, as faith personified and timeless. And in its fidelity to tradition, Bust of Christ refuses the easy melding of artist and subject, or artist and object, and perhaps as a consequence is rarely discussed in studies of Lewis's work. So her Christ isn't a study in realism, verisimilitude, art historical revisionism, or beyond the artist's Catholicism, autobiographical reflection. The face of Lewis's Christ isn't black, it isn't Palestinian Jew. In fact, far from radical in stylistic terms, it's an ideal portrait of Christ. It's almost a sculptural trope. Lewis's immediate predecessors, peers, and contemporaries amongst white American expatriate sculptors in Italy, very few of them Catholic, made different formal decisions when sculpting images of Christ, attempting to find innovative ways to mark out their works in a sea of religious statuary and iconography in their adopted country, including some experimentation with racial signifiers beyond a white European-looking Christ. For them, Catholic subject matter could be approached as exotic or culturally other, in inverted commas. But Lewis's busts of Christ nevertheless shares a number of formal characteristics with the work of her fellow neoclassical artists, particularly the 1845 work Christ by the Boston-born, Rome-based Unitarian sculptor Horatio Greenough. Greenough's Christ was made as a companion piece to his earlier bust, Lucifer, from around 1841, a pendant image common in mid-19th century art, wherein two works related in subject matter are intended to be displayed as a pair. Though a standalone work, Lewis's Christ, made 25 years later, bears a striking resemblance to Greenough's 1845 work. And whether Greenough's influence on Lewis was direct or diffuse, the comparison between the two figures of Christ is nevertheless worthwhile. Both are relatively small in scale, borrowing the form of a Greco-Roman Herm bust, a male bust without arms. Greenough's Christ, like Lewis's, is otherworldly, isolated from his historical moment and biblical context. While the heads of each are clearly similar, what differentiates them is the socle. Where Lewis's is small, plain, and unadorned, the socle of Greenough's Christ and its companion appears in the form of a large coiled serpent. In both works, though, the face of Christ gazes subtly off-axis, echoing the portrait busts of classical antiquity. Art historian and curator Geoffrey Richmond Mall's description of Greenough's Christ could easily be applied to Lewis. He wrote of Greenough's bust, "The bust of Christ is striking in its monumentality, repose, and dignity. The curls of Christ's hair are supple and viscous, pouring down his head and gathering in flowing pools around the jaw and shoulders. Christ's peaceful mouth, relaxed nose, unclenched cheeks, and serenely serious forehead." As Geoffrey Richard Moll has highlighted, mid-19th century sculptors were attentive to facial details because these attributes, he said, were often related to popular theories of physiognomy and phrenology. Every outward feature, even the shape of the mouth, was thought to be a marker for inward character. So such attentiveness, even working in Rome, was particularly crucial for American sculptors in this period, faced as they were with resistance to the very idea of modelling Christ on the part of their largely Protestant audiences at home. So if Greenough was one of the first American expatriate neoclassical sculptors to produce a bust or figure of Christ in 1845, others quickly followed, including Hiram Powers, Thomas Ridgway Gould, and William Wetmore, all sculptors known to Lewis. Figures of Christ by these artists were made mainly in the 1860s, immediately preceding Lewis's 1870 work. Because of the close stylistic, historical, and geographical proximity, it's reasonable to assume that some formal aspects of Lewis's Christ may have been influenced by works such as Powers' Ideal Christ from 1864 or Ridgway Gould's Christ of 1863. Lewis, as a Catholic sculptor in a Catholic country with Catholic patrons and collectors in America and Europe, including commissions from the Catholic Church, arguably had more aesthetic freedom than her Protestant counterparts in terms of the work's likely reception in Britain and America. Conversely, the fact that she was Catholic may be the very reason that her representation of Christ is so conventional and uncontroversial. She took her faith very seriously and wouldn't have risked incurring the disapproval of her Catholic patrons. But in purely descriptive terms, Bust of Christ is a small neoclassical sculpture on a religious theme, relatively unremarkable, almost commonplace image of Jesus Christ. In the artist's wider oeuvre, it could be regarded as a minor work, apparently less characteristic than the subjects and themes for which he's better known. But if this is the case, why are we looking at it? What's significant or interesting about the work? Here are some proposals. Firstly, it's an example of a lesser known and under-researched subject matter in Lewis's work, particularly in relation to the religious and political context of its era in Britain and America. Related to that, it's also an example of Lewis's ability to adapt to changing tastes and markets. As interest in her abolitionist subject matter declined, her religious works and commissions increased. It's also an example of one of her most frequently produced forms of sculpture, the portrait bust. The portrait bust formed a major part of Lewis's output in her lifetime, so perhaps the bust is worthy of consideration on this basis alone. And as I hope I've highlighted, the work also tells an unusual story of patronage, one which remains outside the patterns usually associated with Lewis. References abound to Lewis as an African and Native American artist who sculpted busts of white champions of liberty for white American clients. And while art historians such as Charmaine Nelson, Marion Richardson, and others have countered this, arguing for the significance of African American collectors as subjects and patrons, the third Marquis of Bute presents yet another very different example of the artist-patron dynamic. And if, as many writers and researchers do, we choose to analyse Lewis's works as reflective of her intersectional, biracial, gender and sexual identity, her devout Catholicism adds another further complex layer to the relationship between artist and object. Her religion represents a far less visible and, for many, less palatable or timely aspect of her story. And on its own terms, this work could be seen as a relatively rare example of a sculpture of Christ by an American artist in a period which was vehemently anti-Catholic and deeply suspicious of religious popish sculpture that could be seen as idolatry. That the work ended up in the west of Scotland creates further political and religious context worth exploring. I'm going to pick up on a couple of areas of significance as we draw to a close. So let's consider the fact, for example, that Lewis's portrait busts account for between a third to a half of her artistic output. According to Harry and Albert Henderson's book, Bust of Christ is one of 49 portrait busts within an overall output of 106 individual sculptures made by Lewis during her lifetime. In this sense, then, perhaps the portrait bust form was to Lewis what TV adverts are to film actors, stock in trade ways of financing more ambitious projects. In October 2021, after over 100 years in storage in the lumber room, the bust was placed and carefully cleaned in a prominent location in the entrance hall of Mount Stewart, close to the site of its 1905 earlier display in the Marble Hall. Curator Jessica Inslee has explained that the entrance hall was selected for a number of reasons. In her notes for tour guides, Inslee wrote that the work, quote, now sits in front of a stained glass window by Nathaniel Westlake depicting the Visitation, in which the Virgin Mary, who was pregnant with Jesus, meets her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with St. John the Baptist. The episode is one of the standard scenes shown in cycles of the life of the Virgin in art, and sometimes of the life of Christ in art, a particularly appropriate home for Bust of Christ, and a point that would certainly not have been lost on either Edmonia Lewis or the third Marquis of Bute. Inslee adds that in its new location, the bust is also overlooked by the portrait of the third Marquis of Bute, painted by Sir James Gunn in 1936, which allows Lewis and her patron to be connected within the space. So in conclusion, without wishing to fall into the very art historical traps so eloquently discussed by Kirsten Pye Buick in her book mentioned earlier, it's perhaps worth reflecting on the fact that Bust of Christ was a sculpture produced by a biracial Black and Chippewa American woman, bought by a white Scottish man, sometime in the late 19th century. In terms of the contemporary political and cultural resonances of the work, it feels very significant that Mount Stewart chose to redisplay the work in 2021, the year following the murder of George Floyd, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's surely worth noting that in a period marked by intense debates over contemporary iconoclasm and the destruction or removal of statues representing Britain's active participation in the transatlantic trade in enslaved people, Bust of Christ was produced against challenging odds by the daughter of a freed slave. It was made by an artist whose early career was built on statues and busts of abolitionist figures. So perhaps in the year following the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, and the ongoing arguments surrounding the statue of Henry Dundas in Edinburgh and many other examples, Lewis's bust of Christ could be seen to represent an alternative, perhaps more hopeful story. Regardless of religious belief, perhaps bust of Christ could be seen as a symbol of humanity and cross-cultural fellowship between artist and patron, a work which represents a Black and Native American woman as an active producer of culture rather than the subject of it. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Sorry, I like to keep you in suspense as to whether I'm going to come back on again. Oh, thank you so much for that, Susannah. That was wonderful, wonderful talk. And my question was going to be about why this research was important, which is what you actually came to in your conclusion. So thank you for that. But I was thinking, although you've said that this was quite a minor work and sort of unremarkable, if this was the only figure of Christ that she made in her career, is that right?
Let me think. There are probably Lewis experts who can answer that question. I think she will have made others. I can't think of any off the top of my head. She made quite a few of the Virgin Mary, the Madonna, and other kind of religious themed subjects, so biblical subjects. Hagar, for example, is one that I can think of. So there was a lot of biblical work that she made towards the end of her career from 1870, but increasingly in the 1880s. And I don't know about another bust of Christ, not that I'm aware of.
I was just thinking that to bring Christ to life in marble as a Catholic, could have been a very spiritual and moving experience for her. And I don't really have a question, but like you'd feel that she would have written about it or told someone about her experience with it.
She was producing a lot of Catholic sculpture at that point. Some, I think it was to work on more ambitious projects, bigger projects. So she was quite savvy in terms of marketing and knowing the market. And I think, but she was very devout as well. So she would have certainly taken it really seriously. And I feel that John Crichton Stewart, again, it's interesting that I think you see the bust of Christ placed in a domestic context rather than a religious context in Mount Stewart. So it does seem to be a kind of a reflective, meditative piece rather than used in a religious ceremony, for example. Although we know that he did order an altar piece as well, so there was both happening.
And obviously, you mentioned that she's Catholic and that she was working for Catholic patrons. Was there a sort of Catholic network that she was operating within?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. So. She was reported on several times in the Catholic newspaper, The Tablet. So that was kind of the way of circulating information. It was commented on countless newspaper reports that she was Catholic. Letters from her peers and associates mentioned that she'd converted, although there's lots of discussion that she may have been Catholic as a child or kind of reconverted in adulthood in Rome. So there are differing accounts of the point at which she became Catholic or was already Catholic, kind of inconsistent stories. But it was certainly really important to her, and she was devout until the end of her life and is buried in a Catholic cemetery in London. So it was something she took really seriously, and it does seem that a lot of her patrons especially after Boston and especially when she was living in America, were part of a big Catholic network. So she would go and exhibit work in Catholic fairs in America, for example, that was specifically for Catholic works of art. And there were commissions from Catholic churches in America as well. So there certainly were a network of people, and I think probably word of mouth and a profile as an artist really supported that body of work.
Thank you. Um, so lots of questions coming in now. Melissa has asked if you can glean enough information from the 1905 photograph to say anything about the logic of that display. Is it just a lumber room?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it quite a lot about why it was there and not in a chapel within the house, because there was a private chapel within the house. And I'm still reflecting on that question. And I'd be really interested in what other people think of that. I'm interested in the fact it was in, an extremely grand, but ultimately a domestic space that was, it's a large marble hall, the kind of entrance way into the kind of really, amazing, grand, stately home, of these kind of columns everywhere, lots of stained glass, but placed on a table. Rather than kind of raised up or in a very overtly religious context. The symbolism all the way through the Mount Stuart house. But yeah, it's something that I want to reflect on, and I don't know the answer to that question yet, but it's something that I want to pursue.
Quite a prominent positioning in the hallway.
Yeah, yeah.
Dika asks, is there a difference in gaze in Lewis's work compared with Greenough's bust, offering a counter-narrative?
Is there a difference in what?
Is there a difference in the gaze in those two works?
I think they're kind of pretty similar. They're kind of staring out into the middle distance. And I think what's interesting is that both of them, that it isn't, as I mentioned, not a particular episode that you can identify in the life of Christ. So it just seems to be, again, like a meditative, reflective Christ at rest, Christ in repose. So I think they're fairly similar, but I think that it's quite a conventional, this not focusing on anyone, not looking directly at the audience or the viewer, looking slightly to one side. I think it's an art historical kind of, not trope, but an art historical tradition to have Christ kind of, very serene and holy looking, and kind of not looking directly at someone, looking slightly to one side.
I mean, you talked a bit about her, the whiteness of the marble and kind of purity and that kind of aesthetic. Did she ever use black marble, or and particularly
So
for black sitters? Or
if she did, I don't know, but she did. She did work in marble of African American sitters. So she had patrons that were African American, and there are a few portrait busts, I think, at least one that I can think of off the top of my head, of a black patron, a black sitter. Some of her mythological and abolitionist statues are also in white marble, but clearly of African faces, African people. Like the Forever Free is the really, really famous one.
Just looking to see what else there is here. Nancy was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about Lewis's teaching in Richmond, Virginia.
No, I can't. I really wish I knew about it, but it's only ever mentioned really briefly in the sources that I've looked at. As far as I'm aware, it was just a few months. She attended and did the teaching with a friend, and it was specifically to raise money for the relocation to Italy. But beyond that, I don't know much about it. It's another kind of one of these kind of little clues that are dropped into histories and discussions of Lewis, but there isn't kind of much research there that I'm aware of. But I'm sure my American counterparts will probably know much more about that. But as far as I've been able to tell, a few months just preceding the trip to Italy in the first place in 1865, and with another female friend.
There's a question here from an anonymous. Anonymous says, is there any more information revealed in her letters to Frederick Douglass about her thoughts on her work and art? But can you remind me who Frederick Douglass is?
Yeah, so Frederick Douglass was the orator and kind of abolitionist, major abolitionist figure. I think one of the most photographed men in America at some point, and the subject of Isaac Julian's film Lessons of the Hour. So like a really big figure in contemporary art as well as in his own, his own right. He was a lawyer. And he also features in Maud Salter's account of Edmonia Lewis's life. We know that they met each other. We know that he gave her this advice. It's recounted in other people's reports. I don't know about correspondence between the two, but there are some references and sources that say that they encountered one another again when she was living in Rome, that their paths crossed in the late 1880s, I think.
Thank you. And then finally, as we're coming to past, Morven asks, might you have any reflections on Alberta Whittle's recent work at Mount Stuart, Remembering Wildfire?
Yeah, I just think it's really wonderful that it was placed in exactly the same spot. So the bust of Christ was loaned to an exhibition at Tate Britain, which was a big survey show of women's art. And it was wonderful to see it there, but it was unusual to see it out of its normal kind of Mount Stuart context. But in its place, Alberta Whittle, an amazing artist who had a big solo show at Mount Stuart over the summer, had basically created a tribute to Lewis, another portrait bust of herself, which sat in exactly the same site. And I thought it was a really moving portrait. And I'd like to hear from Alberta how that came about.
Thank you so much, Susannah. Can you just tell us what your plans are with this research?
To publish it. So I've got a very, very long draft that has some of the questions I've been asked tonight that are still unanswered. I've got a very, very long draft that needs to be really chopped down. And once I've got it into a kind of more coherent shape, then I'll hope to publish it as a fairly lengthy article. So I'll let you know when that comes out. But it's basically written, but it needs to be shaped. It needs to be sculpted into a more coherent form.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Susannah. Nancy, I'm going to answer your questions via email, if that's okay. And thank you so much, Susannah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk and for being our art history resident 2023. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everyone, have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.